That is counter to the whole history of telecommunications.
Well, let me say this, Mr. May. I agree with you. It should be technology neutral, but I do think that it's fairly obvious that wireless is a more efficient technology. Now, I agree with Ms. Patterson that today wireless does not have the robustness, the reliability, the capacity as fiber. But we've just done the 700 auction, and we're about to see 4G wireless, broadband wireless, and over the next 10 years, wireless will be as robust, reliable, and have the broadband capabilities that today wireline has, but it will be lower cost. And it can reach into geographic areas and smaller markets more efficiently and at a lower cost. I think what our policy should be, Mr. Chairman, is to look over a 10-year transition. How do we incentivize broadband? How do we go to the least cost, which is probably wireless? And how do we maintain competition? I don't think that two providers, a duopoly or a monopoly, is what our government's policy should be, and we should try to find the incentives to get us there in education, telemedicine, and in competition. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Great. Gentleman yields back. And without objection, I move to enter into the record the following. The testimony for this hearing by the National Tribal Communications Association, including their comments in the FCC's ongoing proceeding, and a statement by Willard Nichols, President of the American Public Communications Council. Now we're going to recognize each of you for 1 minute. Tell us what you want us to know as we go forward looking at reforming the Universal Service Fund. What should our goals be? We'll begin with you, Mr. May.
Thank you, Mr. Markey, and thanks for holding the hearing. I think it is very important to focus on the future of universal service, and I think this has been a useful discussion. I think there's significant agreement that with respect to narrowband service, the original goals of universal service have been largely achieved, and that's why the focus has been on broadband today. I just want to reiterate that as we examine that issue, the basic principles that should guide us are really important. Number one, market forces should be relied on to the greatest extent possible in order to avoid the costs that we incur when we provide subsidies. We're in places where market forces aren't going to provide service or haven't provided service, then subsidies may be appropriate. And in distributing those subsidies, it's important that they be targeted as narrowly as possible to achieve the objective. And it's important that the financing system for those subsidies be as broad as possible. And I would say that actually the subsidies should be financed through the general treasury if this is an important national goal, the promotion of broadband. But those principles are, in my view, very important to keep in mind as you think about how to get broadband dispersed to the country as widely as we want it to be without market forces.
Thank you, Mr. May, very much. Mr. Ramsey.
Mr. Chairman and committee, the key principle for me is that as we live in the 21st century, to reform the universal service, to think not only in terms of supply but also demand, as I mentioned earlier, to not only look at the issue of access, but to make sure we're looking at affordability as well as the applications, the adoption of that technology. And as we're thinking about education, to think about an expanded 21st century learning environment that is both the school, the home, as well as the community. And one very specific issue is, again, to think about, as we expand opportunities potentially for digital technology, in thinking about the home, let's think about low-income people who live in public housing in every community in this country. We could do something very targeted, very focused, much like how we focused on schools. We could do that in housing for the poorest of the poor and really bring digital opportunity to every single person.
I would like to work with you on that, Mr. Ramsey, as we're going forward. I think it's a very important problem. Mr. Lucas.
I think I'm going to move to Mississippi because he seems to have the right idea about things. But it's extremely important to bring wireless and broadband into the schools. as well as the rest of our country. You know, what we were arguing here is to invest in the printing press. You know, Abraham Lincoln couldn't read his books by the fire if we didn't have the printing press in rural Illinois. And at the same time, we're also thinking about financing federal roads so that people that are lost out in the wilderness, people who need to get their products from market to homes and that sort of thing, have a way of doing it. That is what this is. This is the transportation system of the future. This is the printing press of the future. And our schools won't be able to exist without it.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas, very much. Ms. Patterson.
Well, I would like to say that Abraham Lincoln probably could not have won the Civil War without the telegraph. So I would point out that technology is very important. We need to have a national commitment to broadband, and this House members should, in fact, I think, support that. Secondly, we should revamp the Universal Services Fund and move it towards broadband. Third, it should be a partnership between state, federal, and local government. And fourth, we should invite everyone to participate. The private sector should lead if at all possible, but if not, we should really provide the subsidies to bring about universal broadband.
Thank you, Ms. Patterson. We'll just wait 10 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, phone communication
Ms. Sullivan, you're recognized, Mr. Sullivan.
is the most important means of keeping people in prison together with their families and not recidivating. Progress on reducing these high costs of these phone calls have been made in regard to interstate calls, but not in regard to interstate calls. I wanted to share with Mr. Terry, and maybe his staff is here, that Nebraska did a very good thing a few years ago. Because of the pro-family policy, they cut out the commissions that they were receiving from the phone company. Even though Florida has the best system right now, Nebraska is very close, and so it can be done. Passage of H.R. 555 by Congressman Bobby Rush of this committee would go a long way to reducing the high costs of these interstate phone calls. 555 is basically a resolution. It does not tie the hands of the FCC. It just encourages them to do something about the exorbitant rates that families are being charged to communicate with their loved ones.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan, for your testimony. We thank each of you. We can look back now at the 1996 Telecommunications Act, and we can see that on the day that it passed, only 4% of schools had access to the Internet, and now 94% of schools have access. So that's a success. But as we analyze it today, we can see that there are problems with rising rural rates, that there are problems in the rural health care communications program, that there are 11% now fees on telephone calls. But at the same time, we can see this rapid pace of technological change as well, and we have to make sure that the poorest children are kept up to speed. You can't support NAFTA and GATT the way I did, speeding up the economy, and not simultaneously speed up the rate at which the young people in our country gain access to the skill sets for these new jobs, or else we'll be continually besieged by high-tech firms begging us to have more H-1B visas that we can bring people in from around the world who are being given these skills, as Mr. Lucas says, that we put our own young people at a disadvantage if we don't give them access to those skill sets. So in many respects, what we did in 1996 seems like a galaxy far, far away in terms of these modern technologies. And it is our responsibility to focus not only on that, but on the future and what we have to do while we're protecting ratepayers, making sure it's more efficient, but also making sure that we make our country a brighter, more prosperous place, not just for the well-to-do, but for everyone. We owe that to all of the young people in our country, and your testimony today helps us to focus upon that objective. With that, and the thanks of the committee, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.
Send me a copy of A4.